Hey y'all, thanks so much for joining me, Kelly, aka The Wandering Widow. On this show, we will address the many aspects of life after loss and the journey towards wellness and wholeness through exploration of self, planet, and all the relationships that we make along the way. We're going to do so with a little bit of grit, some grace, and a dose of that dark sense of humor. Hopefully you'll laugh. I'll likely cry. Everything's fine. I don't need to tell anyone who has suffered a loss that there is a lot of labor left of dealing with the emotional and the physical stuff that we are left to manage. And trust me when I say I know that there's plenty to manage in both of those categories, whether you are going through a divorce or loss of a loved one or loss of a pet, a loss of any kind. For clarity's sake, in today's episode, we're going to be primarily talking about the physical stuff that is taking up space in our lives, and we'll be talking about that through the lens of my own personal story and experience, and some of these things will be more of a do as I say, not as I do, trying to help y'all out. So to start off, there are two tracks associated with the management of physical items. They're going to be time-bound by necessity or the less pressing or less time-bound. There may be situations that require us to move and manage physical stuff on a timetable that doesn't actually belong to us, meaning we aren't moving things or selling or items because we're quote unquote ready, but because there's more of a pressing or urgent need for us to do so. And I would love, love, love it if we lived in a world in which I could pick up the phone and I could call the bank for you. I could talk to somebody about holding your mortgage and your car loans, maybe your credit card debt without penalty until we all felt like you were prepared to emotionally handle the strain of figuring these items out, of the selling and of the moving. Unfortunately, no one has put me in charge yet. And none of those institutions give an F about holding off those financial fees. They don't even care about death. They will say that they're sorry, and penalties do not stop. Fees do not cease. And because of this, we might be put in a situation where some items take priority, and the decision around how we do things or why we do things or why we're letting them go are really dictated by circumstances outside of our control. For example, I had to sell Clint's car pretty quickly, and not just because I couldn't drive it, not just because it was a little sports car that I did not know how to operate, but because I couldn't manage the payments by myself. And because I needed that extra cash flow to help to bridge the gap of a financial strain that his loss and the loss of his working income had created for me. And this is a very typical situation for widows. This is not singularly challenging. This is a real stressor that many of us that have suffered a loss have experienced. So I just wanted to recognize that. And regardless of circumstance, there will inevitably be a time that we can start to take a look at the rest of the things that we're left with. After Clint passed, my therapist urged me not to get rid of anything that I felt really sentimental around or that had any kind of potential sentimental value for at least a year, because that first year was like a crazy shitstorm of highs and lows as you're swinging through grief, and you could be stuck in an emotional experience and feel like I have to get rid of everything. And then the pendulum swings and you are buried in regret and sorrow that you don't have those personal items that actually really did mean something to you, but you were just having a moment. Or, the flip side, you can't let go of anything because everything feels like it has value, like every toothbrush, every hanky that they used, like it's just so intensely emotional that we're not necessarily thinking straight about what has value and what doesn't. So I found that advice to be really helpful, with the one caveat that you have to be mindful around what actually has sentimental value and what doesn't. So if you are faced with the extreme luxury of having extra time and space to be able to kind of get your mind right before you make any really big, heavy decisions, use that privilege and don't make any of those big, heavy decisions until you feel really grounded and clear about and okay with doing so. In my own experience, I found that going through and cleaning and sorting some of Clint's personal items actually felt cathartic and it felt really soothing. So, in going through his home office desk, I started keeping track of how many little collectibles I was finding. I did not realize that my husband was such a collector of pocket knives and flashlights and sunglasses. I found this to be true pretty quickly when I started opening drawers, and it made me smile internally, thinking about how many of these items he must have purchased and hid these purchases away from his very loving, sometimes irritatingly budget minded wife. And so I started creating stacks of all of these different things, right? Like piles of flashlights. And this stuff really didn't mean much to me. It didn't mean anything to me outside of those smiles, that internal smiles that they were creating when I thought about Clint collecting them. So because they didn't have any marked emotional tie, I started divvying these items up for some of his man friends, some of his really close friends. Ironically, backpacks were also something that he seemed to be a collector of. Did not realize that until, again, after his passing. So each one of these men closest to him got a backpack, and in that backpack was a flashlight, a pocket knife, a pair of sunglasses, and maybe any other additional items that I felt had marked significant value or emotional value for his friend, for this man in his life, but did not have significant emotional value in its tie to me. And I took special care when I chose who received what. And I thought about the relationship and what that relationship meant to Clint and what that relationship meant to the friend. For example, my brother received Clint's favorite backpack, and he received the knife that Clint carried with him every single day. And that was because of their closeness, because I knew that Ben would see those items and he would immediately recognize them as things that Clint carried with him daily. And because of that, they carried a significant emotional value or weight and connection to Clint. So I wanted to ensure that they went to someone that would see that, recognize that, appreciate that, and also apply a similar emotional tied value to those items. And I share this not as a guiding rule, but more as an example of how personal and how varied this process really is and can be. I went through Clint's desk in probably the week after his passing, and that's because that's where he sat most often in his life, and I yearned to be close to the items that he was physically closest to. Not because I wanted anything to be gone or put away or given away. It served my emotional need of feeling close to Clint while also bridging a gap between Clint and his friends that I knew also felt grief around his death, and that they might be somehow comforted to have some of these items that they knew were in his ownership and were now in their ownership. So I suppose the first steps in going through personal items would have to be deciding your why. Why are you sorting? Is it by necessity, or is it to serve an emotional need? And is that emotional need potentially fleeting? And if so, perhaps give it the space of a few days to ensure that you don't change your mind. So how do you even know that a emotional need is fleeting? I would say if it is incredibly passionate, if it is very deeply emotional, give yourself a little bit of time and space to move and breathe through it. For example, every time I walked into the closet to change clothes and I looked at Clint's stacks of t-shirts and his hanging pants, I became really emotional. And there was one day that I was like, it has to all be gone. It has to be gone. Like, I can't look at this every day. And I was very emotional and wailed and cried around being faced with all of his clothing. But I removed myself and I let myself feel the emotion. I let myself move through it. I let myself cry, but took myself out of the physical closet and thought, okay, like, I'm just going to give it a day. I'm going to give it a day. And if I want it gone tomorrow, then maybe I'll do it tomorrow. Well, I walked in there the next day and I was actually soothed by looking at some of these pieces of clothing that reminded me of Clint, that still smelled like Clint. And I wasn't ready for them to be packed up or donated or given away. And I was really glad that I had not done so. So that's a good example of the, checking into the emotional need, and also being mindful that there can be that pendulum swing and shift. So if you have the time and space to allow for yourself to keep an item there to really be sure, you might as well lean in and be sure. So in the example of the backpacks, there were a couple of decisions that I had to make. I established my why in that case, and it was twofold, or maybe even more than that. Threefold, fourfold, I don't know. I needed to go through and find financial documents that were in that desk. I needed to know what bills had been paid, what bills we were delinquent on. I needed to start figuring out tax kind of things. And I knew that all of those items were in the desk. And I knew that I also wanted to feel close to Clint, as I'd mentioned before. And I wasn't quite ready to sort through anything that I felt that really intense emotion around. This is a week after he passed, so clearly I was not ready to do any of that kind of heavy lifting. I wanted to make sure that these items that I saw got to his friends, so that would help to kind of soothe and connect them. And also in the back of my head, I knew that I was living in a house full of mostly his stuff that I would eventually need to downsize out of. And this wasn't at the forefront of thought. Like I said, this was like a week after he passed, but it was definitely there. It was lingering somewhere in my subconscious that I was not going to be able to live in this large house by myself, and that I would have to eventually start to kind of go through the layers of all of our collected things. I knew that to do that, I needed to start somewhere small, and starting at the desk offered some kind of sweetness with the potential of sharing items with his guys that, made me kind of enjoy that internal smile from time to time. So I eventually started a little tick mark list of how many pocket knives I found, how many sunglasses I found, and I took a picture of that list and was texting it to some of his close friends that we both shared. And we got to share in laughter together about how ridiculously extra Clint was. So that's a lot of different kind of whys, but I was very clear on why am I clearing out the desk right here, right now. The next step is establishing your how. How are you going to approach this project? And it helps to have a plan. You need to figure out, all right, am I going to go item by item? Am I going to go room by room? Am I going to go area by area? Am I going to do this by myself, or am I going to have help? If I have help, who is going to be most efficient in helping me, and who is going to be supportive through this process? And then how am I going to be sorting these items? And my experience, obviously, I had the piles of different stuff that I knew was going to go into each one of the backpacks, but I also had multiple bins in front of me. I had a bin for paperwork. I had a bin for things that needed to be shredded. I had a bin for things that were going to be donated, for trash, and for things that I didn't know what I needed to do with. And it was just like a holding space. I highly recommend having some kind of process similar to that, whether it's you're going through an area, a room, or a whole household. You have to have a plan for how things are going to be sorted, and then when they are sorted, where they're going to go. I knew I wanted to do this by myself, that I wanted to touch each one of the items. I wanted to take my time with it. But I also knew that I was in a time-bound kind of situation in reference to that desk. So I needed to get through it within a day so that I could figure out the next right step in connection to some lawyer's situations, some financial situations. So I set hour-long increments on my phone, and at the chirp of the timer after every hour, I gave myself 15 to 30 minutes to take a step away, to go outside on the porch and take a breath and let a little bit of sunshine hit my face, to cuddle with my dogs, or to just lay on the floor and wail in agony for 15 to 30 minutes. But then I would get back up and I would have to be back at it because, again, I needed to be done in a day. And time is so weird and ethereal in the grief process where minutes can feel like hours or like they just went by in the blink of an eye. So there was something comforting about bookending the sorting with marked moments in time that I was not in charge of keeping track of. And pacing myself through that highly emotionally charged event was really important to my well-being. So I highly recommend that you figure out how to do that for yourself, whether it is working with someone else that is keeping time for you. If you're doing it by yourself, maybe have a plan around setting a timer on your phone like I did, or something that's going to work similarly for you to keep you on track, but also ensure that you're taking care of your emotional well-being. And if you've decided that you want help and support of other people, and maybe you haven't decided, maybe you have to do that by pure necessity. That's also an option, right? Be sure that you're clear on how you want things to go. And if the process is time sensitive and requires the help of many helping hands, perhaps clearing and sorting, I don't know, items of a parent or a loved one, just know that there are also services that you can hire that can assist with estate management. There are services out there that this is all that they do. So they are staffed with kind-hearted people that are familiar with this process and know how to assist you in a way that will keep you on track. And they also have all of the answers to questions that we as grievers probably wouldn't even think to ask. So when it came time for me to move from my marital home to a downsized house, I knew that I needed to ask for help because Clint was a car guy. He was a motorcycle guy. He was I can fix this random thing kind of guy. And that meant that we had a garage full of items that I knew had value, but I didn't know, first of all, how to handle it. And y'all, there was shit in that garage that I didn't even know what it was, like vaguely tool-shaped hunks of metal that I knew had value, but I didn't know how to manage. So almost 2 years after Clint passed, I asked for help. I asked some of his friends to help with sorting and with selling. And it was hard. It was emotional and it was tough. And it wasn't emotional and tough because I was somehow attached to any of those weird hunks of metal, but it was because I knew that Clint had been very attached to some of those hunks of metal. And he spent a ton of his time and energy and our dollars on these items in the garage. And I also recognized that clearing out the garage really marked the end of living in our shared home. And so I did have to kindly remind myself several times that just because an item meant something to Clint, that didn't mean that it had to mean something to me. And this was hard, but it was something that I knew had to get done. And unfortunately, if you are a fellow griever, then you are all too familiar with the sensation of, this is hard. This is really hard, but it has to get done. 2 years after Clint had passed was the cleaning and sorting of the garage items. And in the week after he died, that was when I was sitting in front of his desk cleaning and sorting items. So there are layers to these things. And if we have the extreme privilege of time, then we can move layer by layer as we and as our hearts and our finances even and our spirits are ready. So next question, how do you know when you're ready? How do you establish your when? When is big, right? And I wish I had a magical formula where you could plot in a couple of dates and boom, you would know this is when I am emotionally secure and grounded enough to let go of these items. But I don't have that. You know that grieving is as individual to the person as the grieved relationship or grieved loss is. And I have a weird connection, or maybe not even connection, more a non-connection. I have a weird non-connection to stuff. And somewhat ironically, that comes from a conversation that I had with Clint as we were put in a position where we had to manage several estates of some of his loved ones that passed throughout the years of our marriage. And it was in these events that I reframed some of the importance that I put onto things. Because in that situation, I found myself looking at Clint and asking, are you sure? Are you sure you don't want this whatever? Are you sure you want to donate this XYZ? And Clint was always very clear about what he wanted to keep and what he didn't. And, you know, I come back to this conversation that Clint and I had time and time again. Even now, when I think about purchasing something new for myself, I think about this conversation. And I'm going to do my best not to cry here. And I'm going to do my best to remember exactly how he said this to me. And anyone who knew him knows that there's going to be some cursing involved. So if you have little ones, now is the time to put the headphones in. It's just stuff, Kelly. It's just stuff. They didn't get to take it with them when they died because it doesn't fucking mean anything. It's just a fucking thing. And me keeping it, it's not going to bring them back. It's not going to make me fucking miss them any less, or it's not going to make me love them anymore. It's just going to take up fucking space in our house, and it's going to be one more thing that takes up space and a piece of shit that's collecting dust. And then somebody's going to have to decide what to do with this random ass thing that once belonged to my grandmother, and nobody else knows what to do with it after you and I are dead. I'll never understand why some people keep shrines to dead people. You think they would have wanted you to look at that shit every day? You think that my grandmother wants me to walk past some shit and cry every day? Nah, fuck that. Get rid of that shit. And if I go first, get rid of my shit and buy yourself something that makes you happy. You still with me? At the time that he said those things, y'all, I thought there was a version of him that was almost callous and cold. And the more loss that we suffered together, the more I realized that it was incredibly wise. You know, I thought at the time, how could he be okay with not keeping more than a couple of rugs from his grandmother? Or why didn't he want more from his uncle other than this little Zippo lighter? But I keep coming back to this conversation. I come back to it all the time, probably thousands of times over the years. And honestly, I probably still hold on to more of his items than he would want from me or of me. I mean, hell, I'm wearing one of his shirts right now as I create this podcast. But I do believe that those words are incredibly wise, and they have served me very well in my own grieving process. Stuff is just stuff. And what we decide to put value on is up to us, the living. Those of us that are moving on and that are putting one foot in front of the other and being by necessity in positions where we continue to go through life. So I find it helpful to ask, does keeping this item bring me closer to emotional freedom and well-being, or does it bring me farther away? And as time moves along and we walk with our grief and we learn to love through the new world that we are being forced to live in and forced to live in this new way, the physical items that are left behind by our loved ones, we recognize only have meaning if we put meaning upon it. They only mean something if we decide that they mean something. So when we look at an item or we hold an item, how do we feel? What does the item bring into our current lives? And listen to your gut, y'all. You're going to know. You likely intuitively know what items are going to mean something to you long term. Is holding onto this item enriching my life? Does it bring me peace or enjoyment? And there are some items that absolutely did not pass that test for me, and I still have heart tugs around and emotion around. And I still had, when I thought of letting it go, I still was unsure. And so something that I've done for some of those items that I took a picture of it. I took a picture of the item because that was sufficient for satisfying the emotional urge that I had to be able to look at the item and reflect on the memory that was attached to that thing, but I didn't need to keep the thing itself. I'll likely always hold on to some things that don't really serve a purpose other than just tugging at my heartstrings or bringing sweetness of remembrance and warm memories. And I have made peace with that, and that is okay because I also have the luxury of a little bit of physical space for those items in my home, and those items have become a part of my life, a part of my home. So I'm interested in hearing from you, listeners. Do any of these how or why and when tips resonate for you? Are they helpful? Do you have your own experiences connected around the stuff that you're left with? And do you have tips or tools that might be helpful for our fellow grief walkers and our fellow joy tenders? If so, I would love, love, love to hear from you. Drop me a message on Instagram or send me an email, and then I would be more than happy to share those reflections with the community as a whole. A new thing in the podcast is I am going to be closing with grief that I am feeling and a joy that I am tending. And today I am grieving the loss of a family friend's child. And I know that that is a heavy thing to say and a hard thing to hear. And this life is temporary, and it is sometimes faced with really difficult losses and challenges. And it's a really intense reminder that we need to hug our people, and we need to tell them that we love them and what they mean to us, and not to leave things unsaid, because nothing in this life is guaranteed. And that is both a really beautiful and really challenging thing to hear, and is, I think, a really powerful reminder for all of us. And I would like to fold myself into some of the joy that I feel and some of the joy that I am tending to when I look at some images that were captured by the immensely talented Amelia Winchester. You can find her by Googling her, Amelia Winchester photo. She captured some really lovely images of myself and a dear friend and a travel company business partner, Carrie. And these images, you guys, they represent to me friendship and connection and laughter and lightness, and I'm feeling some serious goddess vibes when I look at them. There was dancing involved on top of a mountain. It was really special. So absolutely joy-inducing, and I'm just really incredibly grateful for those friendships and for that experience. And I would love, love, love to hear what grief you are walking with. And also, please feel invited to tell me what joys you are passionately tending to. I'm sending you all comfort and love. Until next time. Bye, y'all. You guys, thank you so much for spending your time with me. I so appreciate you. If you've enjoyed any part of this podcast, I would also really appreciate a quick review, or maybe share the podcast with someone else in your life that you think might also find value in it. If you've got ideas for things you want me to tackle in future episodes, or if you just want to share a little bit more about your own story, you can find me on Instagram at KH Healing Arts, or you can reach out to me via my webpage. It's khhealingarts.com. I'd love to continue this conversation and get to know you a little bit better. And as always, please know that you are loved, appreciated, and that I hope you are well in all of your wanderings. Yeah, I know that's corny. Doesn't make it less true.